Hi, everyone, and welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn Live series. My name is Dan Vermeer. I'm a professor at the Fuqua School of Business and the Nicholas School of the Environment, and I also direct the Center for Energy Development in the Global Environment. I am really excited to talk with you today. I want to share with you some of the work that we've been doing on oceans and the economy. So in my work, I'm broadly interested in, on one hand, big global challenges like climate change, racial and social equity, water availability, food systems, and so forth, and how they intersect with business strategy. For each of these grand challenges, companies face both risks and opportunities, but these aren't often well understood or anticipated by players in the private sector, and they can be exposed to losses or fail to capture the opportunities that these big global challenges create for them. The work I want to do today is focusing on oceans and sustainable ocean use. Over the last year, we formed a group at Duke University called Oceans at Duke, which is a cross-disciplinary group of faculty and students that are all interested in finding ways to protect the ocean and develop more sustainable ways of using the ocean. We draw on ocean science, ocean governance, and ocean business research and insights to really inform that conversation. And we think that there's more need for this kind of interdisciplinary, holistic, integrated research on one hand, and more outreach to players in the sector who are actually the actors that are having real impacts in these environments. So we live in really interesting times. There's a convergence of crises that all of you have heard lots about in this series and elsewhere: the pandemic, social and racial equity, and the growing climate crisis, all really converging in ways that disrupt business as usual. And there's a similar dynamic at play in the ocean, but one that's probably less well known. On one hand, you have many proponents who are arguing that the oceans are the next economic frontier. They provide great opportunities for increasing economic growth, particularly for coastal and island countries. And at the same time, we see increasing red flags beginning to show around many challenges around ocean climate impacts, acidification, depleting fish stocks, and so forth. And I'm really interested in how we unpack that kind of dynamic and find ways to really promote more sustainable ocean use. Let me start by just giving a little context here on understanding the role that oceans play in our everyday lives. Many of you may not know that about 50 to 70% of all of the oxygen in our atmosphere is produced in the ocean by the action of phytoplankton, who do photosynthesis and put that oxygen into the atmosphere. So 1 out of every 2 breaths that you take today, you can thank the ocean. In terms of protein, fish provide a large amount of the protein that human beings consume. 17% of all animal protein comes from fish, and that's up to 75% in some places that are really dependent on their ocean fisheries. And we expect that this will grow, so that by 2030, the world will eat 20% more fish than they consumed in 2016. Coastal protection. Mangroves, seagrass, and coral reefs are natural barriers, and they can save us money and reduce impacts of storms, flooding, erosion, and so forth. And they actually remove carbon from the atmosphere much faster than what forests do. Climate regulation, a related issue. Oceans are the great carbon sink of the planet, and about 50% more carbon that's actually stored in the oceans than what's in the atmosphere. And so the functioning of the ocean system is critical for climate regulation. In fact, it's the circulation in the Atlantic of the ocean that provides for temperate climates in Europe. And then biodiversity, about 80% of our biodiversity on the planet is in the oceans, some in coastal regions, some in the deep sea, some of which we know a lot about because it's close up, and some we are just discovering. So a lot to be learned there, but obviously the ocean is a huge store of biodiversity. And then our everyday experience of the ocean is the recreation and cultural value that we get from using the oceans. So that's how the ocean ecosystem works and provides value to us. But we also have a very substantial ocean economy. And that economy is made up of two different sectors. On one hand, you have the kind of traditional sectors that are dependent on the ocean or most ocean related, things like shipping and the related services of shipbuilding and repair, the equipment and construction in maritime environments and the ports. So there's a whole system that supports global supply chains that is based in the ocean, depends on the ocean. We also have cruise and coastal tourism, oil and gas, which a large portion of the oil and gas that's produced every year is produced from offshore sources. So that's a really critical input to the energy demand that we're servicing globally. Seafood production, in this case, wild caught, but also aquaculture and processing industry. And then finally, we're increasingly using the ocean as a source of energy, and offshore wind being sort of an emerging player in the kind of the traditional economy. At the same time, there's a whole set of emerging sectors that are also very interesting and which may provide much of the growth for the ocean economy in the future. Other forms of ocean energy, offshore wind, yes, but also wave and various kinds of chemical and mechanical ways of harvesting energy out of the ocean. Seabed mining is growing interest, especially as the demand for things like cobalt that are needed for batteries and EVs and lots of elements of the clean economy. We're increasingly looking at the seabed as a place where those could be sourced. And so while there isn't a lot of that seabed mining, at least in the way we traditionally think about it happening now, there is a lot of expectation that that's an industry which is likely to grow very fast given the demand for the resources that are available there. Marine biotechnology, oceans provide incredible kind of genetic diversity that can be used for producing new treatments or new medicines for viruses, which is obviously relevant now, but also things like cancers. And then ocean high-tech services. So really infusing the ocean economy with the other tools that are used in the rest of the economy, like AI and blockchain and all the other kinds of technology-enabled services. So this is the kind of shape of the current economic ecosystem of the ocean, what exists traditionally as well as what we expect to grow. And if we look forward, we know that the current stocks of wild-caught fisheries are at their maximum in most places, in some places actually over-depleted. And so we expect that to service the increased demand for fish protein, that aquaculture is likely to double by 2050. We expect to see increased demand for oil and gas even as we decarbonize the economy. So we expect that offshore development is an area that's going to continue to grow relatively rapidly. This is one that I think is really pretty stunning. Global maritime transport is expected to expand by about 200% by 2030 and about 400% by 2050. There are tens of thousands of ships on the ocean right now. And when we project these kinds of expectations of growth, we can see that it's going to be a very crowded ocean as more and more people use it for economic uses. And tourism, which makes up about 10% of the global GDP now, is expected to continue to grow. Not currently, obviously, that's an area that's taken a big hit now, but long term. And the kind of associated losses that happen to our ecosystems, the kind of non-market services that the oceans provide, carbon sequestration, coastal protection, waste disposal, and biodiversity, are increasingly threatened by the forces of all of these other economic uses. You can think about the economic value of the ocean, or what some people call the eighth continent, in four categories. On one hand, you have extractive, non-renewable uses of the ocean, things like offshore oil and gas and seabed mining. But you also have extractive use of renewable resources like fisheries, aquaculture, and genetic and medicinal uses. From an operational perspective, oceans provide the basis for tourism, shipping, desalination, and renewable energy, and then those ecosystem services that we talked about. So I wanted to just build a bit of a mental model for you of all the ways that our economy is actually quite closely tied to the ocean. And at the same time, there are urgent warning signals everywhere about the declining health of the ocean. Things like wild stocks that are, decreasing quickly, plastic waste that's increasingly clogging the world's waterways, coral reefs which are disappearing as we speak and may be completely gone by 2050, and that these aren't isolated problems. They're early signs of system failure. And so really the challenge that we face is we have these two conflicting trends. On one hand, growth in the ocean economy. On the other, the decline of the health of the ocean environment. And what we're really interested in is trying to reinvent how we engage in the ocean so that we don't make the same mistakes that we've made in land-based development, which drove real economic gains, but at incredible ecosystem and social costs. Is there a way to do it better than what we've done in the past? That's what has led to the work that we've done in the last few months. Myself and John Verdon, who's at the Nicholas Institute, along with colleagues at the Stockholm Resiliency Center, have recently published a paper in Science Advances called The Ocean 100, Transnational Corporations in the Ocean Economy. You can kind of think about the ocean economy like an ecosystem. It has predators or keystone actors that are at the top of the food pyramid. And then you have a whole set of species that depend on each other, including those at the very base of the system. I think about the economic ecosystem having a similar shape. You have the big keystone actors in the ocean economy at the top, and then you have all the entrepreneurs and startups and innovators at the bottom that are feeding that system, and there's forces for transformation at both of those levels. I want to talk about just that top level today. So we did a study of the Ocean 100. What we did is identify the 8 core industries that are in this space. The ones that I talked about before: shipping and shipbuilding, maritime equipment, seafood production, cruise tourism, port activities, and so forth. And we wanted to find out who are the 100 largest companies in these core industries by revenue. And so we went out and surveyed these companies, and what we found was pretty astounding. 47 of the 100 top ocean companies are actually oil and gas companies. And this is only measuring the revenues that are associated with their offshore production, not their entire revenues. So the irony here is that almost half of the ocean economy are players that probably don't think of themselves as ocean players because more of their business is on land than what's offshore. So the first characteristic is the just incredible dominance of oil and gas companies. The top 10 oil and gas companies exceed the largest company in almost all of the other sectors. So it really is quite dominant in the overall picture. Nevertheless, there are other interesting industries that make up that other roughly 50%. Shipping at the top of that, related services and repair and shipbuilding, sort of supporting industries, also pretty large scale. Seafood production quite low because this only includes the industrial players, not all of the artisanal small scale fisheries, which if you included the number of employees that are employed in small scale fisheries actually would overcome the numbers in all of the other industries combined. So this is only focused on the industrial seafood production, but the small scale fisheries actually play a really important social and economic level at the local community level in coastal areas. And about 60 of these companies are publicly listed. Some of them are state-owned, and some of them have the majority shareholder being the state, but nevertheless, about 60% of these Ocean 100 companies are publicly listed. Just to give you another sort of dimension of this, another finding is that this set of core industries is highly concentrated, as you could hear sort of the hints of that in the previous diagram. The 10 largest companies in these 8 industries generate 45% of the total industry revenues. So just the top players in each of these industries constitute a really large share of the overall revenues. This is even more concentrated in certain of these sectors. For example, cruise tourism, 93% of revenues are made by the top 10 players. In container shipping, it's 85%, and imports, 82%. So very consolidated, big players that own big chunks of these industries. And you can also look at these top 100 in aggregate and see that they together generate about 60% of all revenues of ocean industries. So in a total industry pie of 1.8 billion, you have 1.1 billion that come from these top 100 companies. So these are really important players. You can also see the geographic kind of distribution of them. These are industries that are very globally distributed, but they tend to be concentrated in certain geographies and around certain industries. So United States is the largest in terms of total revenues by geography. Saudi Arabia and China somewhat behind, and then Norway, France, UK, and the others that are listed here on the slide. It's often organized also on the basis of industry. So in oil and gas, you find Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Iran, Mexico, and the US at the top of the list. Shipbuilding and repair, China, Korea, and the US. And then you can see in maritime equipment. So different countries that really lead the world in terms of the concentration of industrial activity in each of these spaces. So I want to just highlight what we hope to do with this study is identify opportunities for breaking through some of the hurdles in really moving toward more sustainable ocean use, and find out where there may be leverage points that we could pull to be able to accelerate the rate of progress. There are real hurdles in this space, no question about it. Significant inequality in terms of who benefits and who absorbs the risks of a degrading ocean environment. And so for some companies, they are able to capture large profits from the ocean, while others have limited access to these markets and yet experience the kind of damage that can occur because of the aggregate economic activity. Ocean industries are not necessarily known for innovation or sustainability as a whole. There are certainly exceptions to that. The shipping industry, for example, made a pretty ambitious commitment to decarbonize shipping recently. The seafood industry obviously has a large stake in maintaining biodiversity in the ocean. So this is not a blanket statement, but in general, ocean industries don't come to the top of the list when you talk about innovation or sustainability. Incentives vary widely across industries. So a fishing company really cares about the biological diversity of the ocean in a way a shipping company probably has less exposure to the biodiversity. They're more interested in being able to navigate that body of water. There are high barriers to entry, which limit newcomers into the space and may make it possible for incumbents to resist change. Ocean governance is really challenging because most of it is beyond the boundary of national jurisdiction. And so what happens on the high seas is a real challenge for us to figure out how do we govern, how do we set rules, and how do we enforce those rules. And because power is concentrated, political power is concentrated also in these few players, they have an ability to really capture the regulatory process. And it's really hard to know who these players are. So there's a lot of opacity in terms of who actually owns the ships that you see out in the ocean. That's the challenge side. Let me point a little bit to what I think are some of the more exciting leverage points for change. Rapidly increasing interest in the blue economy, especially from governments and institutions, means that oceans are now front and center for people in a way that really hasn't happened before. And I would say this has really happened over the last decade. Oceans were always peripheral to our view, where when we planned our economies or we thought about environmental challenges, we often thought about the land-based versions of those things. And I think oceans increasingly are playing a role in countries and institutions thinking about long-term futures, both economic and environmental. The fact that there's a small number of firms that can affect change in this area is actually a benefit in some ways. We do a fair bit of work with World Wildlife Fund, and they talk about the hourglass theory of change, where on one side you have millions of producers that feed these ocean industries, from the small scale fishermen to all of the players who sort of support these industries at the local level. Hard to change at a really sort of basic level with millions and millions of people who are dispersed globally. On the other hand, you have the users of these ocean-based products, which include 90% of all products spend some time on the water, meaning that we all are users of ocean products. And so there are billions of ocean consumers. And that's also really hard to shift that large a number of people in a meaningful way. But because there's just a few companies that sit at the middle of that hourglass between the millions upstream that produce and the billions downstream that consume, these few firms can play a really critical role in being a catalyst for change. And finally, I'm really excited about the kind of emergence of ocean-related innovations, a term that probably didn't really exist until the last 10 years. Blue tech is pointing to all of the ways that new technologies can be brought to bear on a whole set of really exciting new market possibilities. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like to dig into that a bit. But both the blue tech technologies, everything from new ways to produce seaweed to fish-free protein and so forth, really create interesting opportunities for us to reduce the impact and increase the benefits that we get from the ocean. So I want to just close with a couple of thoughts here. One is the power of coalitions. In many other industries like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition or the We're Still In coalition that's focused on climate change, we've seen different economic actors, companies get together to form coalitions to define new ways of working that they can put in place collectively, that there's not somebody who pays all the price up front and then have everybody else follow after, but that they form coalitions to really drive change. There are some in the ocean space that are working. The Global Salmon Initiative, for example, or the World Ocean Council are bodies that have brought together ocean players from across these industries to really drive sustainable change. And we think that there's a great opportunity to do something similar here. In our own future work, we're interested in pursuing a few different strands. One is we don't really know what the environmental footprint of the ocean economy is. And so understanding things like its carbon footprint really could be helpful in bringing the ocean players more centrally into the challenge of addressing climate change. We also think that there's real opportunities for the companies to drive more sustainability in a way that will allow them to pursue their social license to operate, to reduce their risks, and ultimately to capture economic opportunities that come from this. But the key is to not have it be one company at a time, to build coalitions that really can leverage each other and act on these things in a more meaningful way. I just wanted to put a promo out at the end to point you to our Oceans at Duke website, where we're building our resources. The thing that I want you to pay attention to now is we've launched a webinar series where each month we're sharing sort of the best and brightest work that's happening across this range of ocean science, governance, and business at Duke University, and giving a chance to kind of peer in on the latest cutting edge insights on these issues. We think there's enormous opportunity to engage the ocean economy in a new way, to work together with them using science to really drive really credible and effective solutions. And this work is just the beginning of what we hope will unfold over the next several years. So I'll open it up to questions. I'm really pleased to be able to share this with you, and look forward to hearing your thoughts. So I'll turn it back over to you. So we have one question. Seeing lab-grown seafood affecting projections in overall health. I understand there's a lot of companies working on cultured meats. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the most exciting areas, is innovation around finding ways of providing alternatives to traditional proteins. I think this is a really new area. It's one that's got a lot of promise. And in fact, I think the ocean-based industries could play a really important role. We've done some work to explore whether seaweed-based materials could be used as ingredients to offset some of the less healthy elements in, for example, the alternative beef products that are in the market. Those have reduced the kind of the impact on animals. They've reduced their carbon footprint to some extent, but they still are not as healthy as they might be. So finding ocean-based ways of improving the quality of those products, I think, is an area that shows a lot of promise. I know Cargill's doing a lot of work in this space as well. So I think all of the food companies, the companies that are involved in meat production, realize the real constraints that are likely to be placed on their growth long term unless they find innovative ways of providing the same value in ways that are both healthier and less environmentally impactful. Second question, where are the numbers of growth in shipping coming from? So I'd have to point you to our sources. Some of those are in the Ocean 100 paper itself. So you can go to that paper, which was open source and available on Science Advances. There's a lot of notes at the end that would point you to the resources, but I'm happy to pick that up with you. I think those numbers may have changed based on COVID as well. And I haven't seen the updated numbers based on the real disruption that COVID has driven. On the other hand, the shipping companies that observed real impacts on their business in the early months of the pandemic have seen a lot of the demand return. And in fact, you could imagine in a world that's dealing with a pandemic that shipping becomes even more important as people, source products and need them to be delivered to where they are instead of going to those products. So I think the verdict's out exactly how the kind of trajectory of growth is going to be inflected on the basis of COVID. But from what I've seen, I still see really bullish projections of the inevitable growth of this sector based on increasing incomes on one hand and global demand on the other. Third question, since artisanal fisheries employ more than the total of the top industries, is there any data on their total revenues as well? I don't have that here, but I can point you to work that's happening at Duke University. My colleague on this work is John Burden at the Nicholas Institute, and he and Javier Basurto from our Duke Marine Lab have done a lot of work on artisanal fisheries and really promoting that their voice needs to be included in these discussions about the future of the ocean. This is, I think, the ocean, at least one aspect of the ocean's equity challenge, which is that many of the decisions about the future of the ocean have been made by a really limited number of players who have disproportionate economic and political control. And yet those that have the biggest stake often haven't had a voice in those conversations. So bringing in small-scale fisheries and indigenous people, those of you who participated in the webinar series that we did yesterday, we unpacked some of those issues, thinking about how indigenous voices can play a role in ocean conservation and really need to be included and centered in these discussions because their stake is at least as great, if not greater, than many of the people who are actually empowered to make those decisions. Good. So I think we are at the end of our time. I'm really pleased to share this research with you and excited to hear from any of you who are interested in learning more, who are working on similar things, or would like to brainstorm ways for us to build on this work. Next week, every week, we bring back another great scholar at Fuqua to do another LinkedIn Live session. Next week, David Ridley will share his insights from new research that suggests that the way Medicare pays for healthcare providers for drugs inadvertently encourages drug makers to charge higher prices. So glad that you could make it. Really excited to engage with you, and welcome back next week. Thank you.